British Library for helping us to put today's session on. All right, so we've got our guests up on stage with us already. Welcome to Claire Breay, Chintan Chandrachud, David Carpenter and Helena Kennedy in conversation with Patrick French. Please welcome them.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back on the Saturday morning of the Jaipur Literature Festival. This is when the action really starts and kicks off. Now, we've got quite a variety of panelists here to talk about Magna Carta. We have David Carpenter is very much going to be the expert on the context of how and why and when. David Carpenter is going to be giving us context of how and where and when Magna Carta was created. Claire Breay will talk also about that, and then I think more generally about the magnificent British Library exhibition, which I'm sure some of you at least have seen. And there's a sort of small travelling version of it here, I think we can say. Helena Kennedy is, in the UK, a prominent public voice and lawyer, and she'll talk more generally about what the applicability or not of Magna Carta may be. And Chintan Chandrachud is a lawyer and also a specialist in constitutional law. He is also, coincidentally, my cousin-in-law, just to keep law as the subject. So I think, David, can I ask you first to simply explain what is Magna Carta?
Well, Magna Carta is a Latin document, and there's a facsimile on it on the front of the cover of my book about Magna Carta. So I thought I ought to start by promoting that, as it's a literary festival. And I gather it's on sale here. So it says at the end, the book is a landmark in Magna Carta studies. And I can't blame Penguin for that piece of hyperbole, because I wrote it myself. But the Charter is a document, and there's a wonderful facsimile of it just around the corner in the exhibition Claire has brought. It's a Latin document. It's 3,500 words long. It's issued in the name of the then King of England, King John. It's conventionally divided up into 63 chapters. Now, why is it so famous? It's because it does assert a fundamental principle that the ruler is subject to the law, that he can't just simply say, off with your head, into prison, I'm seizing your property. If he wants to do anything like that, he has to go through due legal process. And whereas other European constitutional documents at the time asserted that principle, it's many, many centuries old, European-wide, what the Charter was unique in doing was asserting it across the whole range of government activity: law, local government, finance, the church, relationship with the barons. But just two quick qualifications. The first is that this is, to some extent, an elitist baronial document. It doesn't offer these privileges to everyone. And if we take this great room here, the great majority of you in 13th century England would have been unfree peasants, villeins, and none of you would have benefited directly from the Charter, because the Charter was only given to people who were free. So actually you would be discriminated against, and to some extent women would be discriminated against too, although there are very important chapters which actually preserve the rights of women, and particularly of widows, from being forcibly remarried. But women are also discriminated against. So that, if you like, is the Charter. How is it there? It's produced by a very oppressive system of government and by a horrific king. One of my great colleagues, Magna Carta pundit, described King John as a shit, and there's an awful lot of truth in that.
Is that a technical term?
It's not a technical term, and when I've used it occasionally on the radio in a rather austere, respectable Britain, I've been told if I repeat this, we'll be taken off the air.
Okay, I'm going to move on quickly now to Claire. Could you just say a little more about the historical context in which the document was created? And will you also touch on what it is physically? How many sort of surviving versions of Magna Carta are there?
Well, there are 4 surviving copies of Magna Carta. At least 13 were written up and sent out after the meeting at Runnymede in June 1215. We know that 13 were definitely sent out, and they seem to have been sent to the bishops. The church seems to have played a really important role in dissemination of Magna Carta. Of those originals, 4 now survive, and 2 of them are kept at the British Library in London, have to say one of them is in much better condition than the other, and it's the facsimile of the one that's in the best condition that we have on display around the corner from Durbar Hall. And then the two others are held at Lincoln Cathedral and at Salisbury Cathedral. And one of the things we did in 2015 for the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta was to bring those 4 documents together for the first time at the beginning of February to try and mark the beginning of the anniversary year in a really big way. And we had a public day. There was a ballot. 50,000 people entered a ballot to win one of 1,215 tickets to come and see the documents. And I think, you know, there's always a real excitement about it.
A little about how they look, how they feel.
They are, I mean, the British Library's Magna Carta documents were displayed in this exhibition in 2015, but they're normally in the Treasures Gallery at the British Library. And I think it's fair to say that they are not, you know, the most beautiful things that we have on display. They are written on single sheets of parchment made from sheepskin, and they are very plain text. They're written in absolutely tiny handwriting, fitting in these over 3,500 words of Latin into this relatively small space. But my colleagues at the British Library who look after the exhibitions do surveys from time to time about the visitors, and the thing that always comes top of the list of what people want to see when they come to the British Library is Magna Carta. And in that gallery, we've got the oldest manuscript of the New Testament of the Bible. We've got amazing illuminated manuscripts, including the Lindisfarne Gospels, which was produced around 700, beautifully illuminated manuscript. We've got Leonardo's notebook and that sort of thing, but Magna Carta's the thing they want to see, and people, just in my experience, want to have stood in front of it, and almost everybody who goes to see it, you know, they can't read it, they can't read the Latin or the medieval handwriting. It's not beautiful, but just the power of the document makes people want to feel that they have stood in front of it.
Thank you. So it's in Latin, it's on sheepskin. Helena Kennedy, it's always talked about in the United Kingdom as being the kind of foundation of our law. So I want to ask you whether you think it actually is, but also, can you just touch on the fact that, you know, why it appears to have such a resonance as a phenomenon? I mean, there was an American TV chat show host who said to our former Prime Minister David Cameron, can you translate what Magna Carta means? And he couldn't quite remember, which is not great if you're the Prime Minister. But the idea that it's all about liberty.
It just shows you that an expensive Eton education does not always help you to know your Latin or what your rights are. I think it's very important for us to know that the reification, the kind of celebration of Magna Carta is a comparatively recent thing. I mean, for example, we did not have a great monument at Runnymede. It was the American Bar Association that came and established it at Runnymede in this field not far from Heathrow Airport. You might look out of the plane windows and see it. But it was the American Bar Association because it became quite iconic for Americans. And to tell you the truth, it doesn't have quite the status in law that people attribute to it, but it has taken it on, and that's not insignificant. Sometimes things become iconic and take on meaning and become symbolic just by the sheer sort of mythology that it attracts. And certainly it has come to mean that for British people, or certainly for English people. And I'm a Celt, so I'm always skeptical about the things that are promoted as being the great things English. But it certainly did and has had the effect of saying nobody is above the law. And that is something that we invoke in the courts. It's our judges, I mean, in lots of cases, it's referred to as having this kind of iconic status, meaning that there's no impunity. That's the notion. And whoever you are, and of course it then was about kings and other rulers, but it was supposed to be about holding government to account, really, in some ways. But I just wanted to say that we've got to remember that there are, you know, we like, the British talk about this as if it were the first great rights document. But actually there were rights documents before that, you know, and some of them from the East. And I'm sure that you'd find in most of the sort of ancient religions references to the respect that there should be for the human condition. And, you know, we've got it in all manner of places. And so I don't think we should forget that predating Magna Carta, there were, you know, 6th century BC, the Cyrus cylinder gave rights to prisoners of war. So there are other things that, you know, spoke to rights even before Magna Carta.
Lovely, thank you. And Chintan Chandrachud, I'd like to ask you about how it applies to both the Indian constitution and Indian law. So, I mean, ideally you'd probably want to give a sort of 30-minute answer, but I mean, briefly, how much of Magna Carta can you really say has found its way one way or another, either into the Indian constitution, which was the basis of India as an independent republic in 1950, and into Indian law, the Indian Penal Code and so on, the IPC?
Sure. So I was quite interested in by the fact that several British journalists, for instance, claimed that the Magna Carta laid the foundation stone for the Indian Constitution. And I quote one journalist who said precisely this, around the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta in 2015. I thought it would be worthwhile to go back to the Constituent Assembly debates to look at how the Magna Carta was referenced, whether it was genuinely cited, and whether it had any influence at all in our constitution-making process. Now, what I found was that the Magna Carta was cited in 11 days of debate over a 165-day period. It's been referenced 16 times. As you might imagine, on 13 of these occasions, the references were metaphorical references. In other words, this provision is like a Magna Carta for the Dalits, this provision is like a Magna Carta for the oppressed classes, and so on. There are only 3 substantive references to the Magna Carta in the debates, and those concern the Constituent Assembly debates over the due process clause under the right to life in the Indian Constitution. And so therefore I began to become more and more skeptical about this claim that we can draw individual rights guarantees from the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta has no freedom of speech. The Magna Carta has no freedom of religion. The Magna Carta has no rights provisions that we're used to seeing in modern day constitutions. But as I looked at the subject more and more, I realized that perhaps we need to take a step back and look at what the Magna Carta does for the idea of constitutionalism itself. And I think the Magna Carta is interesting in 3 ways. It's a fundamental charter. So in other words, it's unique on account of the fact that this is a fight for a parchment. It's a fight for a piece of paper, as opposed to being a fight in favor of a monarch or an individual, which is unique for its time. Second, it's an entrenched document. In other words, one of the foundations of modern constitutionalism is the fact that a constitutional document is protected from the ordinary political vicissitudes. And this is the kind of notion that the Magna Carta introduced, because several kings made statements that we have no power to alter the Magna Carta, and it's some form of higher lawmaking. There are also some clues that the Magna Carta was an enforceable document. Now, as you know, the Indian Constitution allows any citizen to go straight to the Supreme Court to claim a violation of a fundamental right. Now, this is something that we take for granted today, but certainly couldn't be taken for granted even a few years ago, a few decades ago. And that's another conception that the Magna Carta introduced. So we need to really take a step back and look at the abstract ideals that the Magna Carta introduced for constitutionalism in general, rather than specific rights.
Thanks very much, Chintan. I just want to go back to Claire. I mean, I was surprised when I read the document in full by some of the stuff that was in there about fish weirs on the Thames, about what happens if a man dies owing money to Jews. There were also various named knights who were talking about what they sort of could and couldn't claim and so on. I mean, why is all that in there?
The fish weirs are
What is a fish
most
weir?
frequently cited fish trapper on the River Thames and the Medway, but they were problematic because they impeded navigation. I think one of the things about Magna Carta is, you know, it is the most famous document in English history, but certainly in England, the general public, in my experience, have no idea really what it says. And people are often very surprised when they read it, as you've done, because I think they expect somehow that it will contain more statements of principle, setting out ideas about liberty and freedom and the things that people associate with Magna Carta. But really, you know, the Magna Carta was an attempt to deal with the rebellious barons in 1215, and so it was primarily addressing the complaints of the barons, and they were very unhappy with King John because he had been setting levels of taxation at extortionately high levels and unprecedented levels, and had been setting aside all idea of justice in his treatment of the barons. I mean, they had a lot of complaints, and that's why so many of the clauses in Magna Carta are dealing with these really specific things, and why only a few of those original clauses are still on the statute book today, because the law commissioners in the 19th and 20th centuries have been combing through Magna Carta every so often and repealing the ones that are redundant. But I do think that it's very interesting that people don't really know what Magna Carta says, and that gives it huge flexibility as a symbol, and it's at the heart of why people across the centuries since the Middle Ages have been able to look back to Magna Carta and use it often to support very different causes. And one of the things we tried to bring out in the exhibition was how sometimes at different points in history you could see the, you know, people on different, individuals and groups on different sides of political arguments, both appealing to Magna Carta. It's this incredibly flexible and powerful symbol that people are able to call on.
David, would you just expand on that? Why are all those bits of information included?
Well, I think that's a very important point. I said Magna Carta discriminated against peasants, but nonetheless it does reach out to very broad sections of society. So it reaches out to knights, free men. It also reaches out to towns. So why is there this extraordinary clause in the Charter preventing their fish weirs on the rivers Thames and Medway, which is basically weirs on the river to actually catch fish? It's there because of London. It's because the traders in London, the merchants in London, felt their trade was being impeded by these obstructions in the rivers Thames and Medway. And so actually that clause shows how the Charter reaches out to wide sections of society. And perhaps I could just put that in a slightly wider context than something Helena said about, well, really Magna Carta, its fame is a later invention. That's true, but it's also not true. And I think one really key thing to grasp about the Charter, which has a lot of relevance today, is that it was very famous at the time. I remember hearing human rights lawyers in Russia when I was in St. Petersburg last year, talking very eloquently about the 1991 Russian constitution, how it was full of good things. It asserted all the right principles. The trouble was nobody knew it. Nobody knew what was in the Russian constitution. No one had struggled for it. Nobody cared about it. It was just overwritten in the courts. Now, Magna Carta was totally different. In the 13th century, it was treasured. And it was studied again and again and again. And one of the things that the Magna Carta project last year was able to show was that it was copied again and again. And people commented on the different versions, all in the 13th century. So by the end of the century, it had dug very, very deep roots into English society. And to pick up something you said, also, in a way, it was enforceable. People could appeal to it in the courts, and the courts enforced Magna Carta in the 13th century. So this great foundation for it going around the world was there. And Helena mentioned Runnymede, although modern research suggests actually all the celebrations last year were in the wrong place, and Runnymede wasn't where we thought it thought it was. But it is nonetheless true that it's very close to London Heathrow Airport. And those great jets which take off from London Heathrow fly up over Runnymede, and they fly down its length and disappear in the distance to places like Delhi and the United States. And it is as though they're taking Magna Carta around the world. And I think, that's what has happened. That's why we're here. It's an extraordinary thing to think that this 3,500-word Latin document on parchment is now here in Jaipur. Got thousands of you here. And I think that is right, and the foundations were laid in the 13th century.
Extraordinary to think that the knights and the king chose to meet so near to Heathrow, but what can you say? Helena, I want to ask you about, in your capacity as a human rights lawyer, here is this highly influential document. Here is this idea of English liberty, which was spread around the world in the 17th, 18th century. And yet at the same time, what was the basis of chattel slavery in the Atlantic? It was English property law. I mean, what's going on? Why is the idea of liberty in English law so widespread, and yet it underpinned one of the most terrible trades, one of the most terrible crimes of humanity in the last 500 years?
I mean, we've got to remember that a very substantial part of Magna Carta is about property. It's about property rights. It's about entitlements. The barons were seriously enraged about the fact that they were expected to raise armies because King John was involved in foreign wars. We still get that today. They were being taxed, they felt, excessively. And also because they were having to take all their menfolk off to wars, their own lands were being underdeveloped. And so there was a lot of rage about all of that. And so, of course, it was about the barons asserting their rights in relation to the king. But there are those historians who would say that those things were actually in the law, and that the requirement that the king should take account of his responsibilities to conform to law pre-existed Magna Carta. But I do think writing things down actually does matter, and it's why, I rather regret that we don't have a written constitution in Britain, except that at times I think the flexibility of our own system is a positive. But I hope that we'll celebrate, and that thousands of you will turn up when we celebrate an anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it too has to have, some recognition as being something that is vital in establishing rights and beyond just the oligarchs. And that's what the barons were. They were oligarchs. David is right when he says that there's much more in it. And there were sort of protection. I mean, widows were thrown off their lands almost immediately, and the king would seize land when their menfolk were killed in wars. And so there were some protections given to women, and they weren't to be forced into marriages so that land could become, held by people who were, had faithfulness to the king. But the women don't figure in at all. I mean, it's really about a certain class of men. But it had the seeds of good stuff in it. And even the poor got a little bit, David, because it gave the right to roam to ordinary folk, even the peasant, and it gave the right to collect, foodstuff, to forage in the forests, to collect berries and mushrooms so that they might not starve, a bit of kindling. So they got a meagre bit of stuff out of Magna Carta. But the real stuff of rights, of course, developed over the years, and they've always had to be struggled for. And what David's right is that the ones that stay are ones that kind of have buy-in from the general public. And you need to have that business of people feeling that they had a say in the creation of these documents for them to really have purchase on the collective imagination.
But, I mean, would it be fair to say that the principle of liberty and the application of English law never applied to everybody? Through the colonial period.
All through the colonial period, and in fact we're still seeing a kind of elements of it now in relation to human rights. We've created a Human Rights Act in Britain, and there are those who don't like it, and they don't like it because they don't want it to apply to a whole categories of people. They don't like that it applies to prisoners. They don't like that it applies to immigrants. They don't like that it applies to people whom they consider to be in some way anathema. And so it's not about recognizing the human dignity of every individual. So those struggles continue about wanting to create hierarchies of rights.
Thank you. So, Chintan, you might want to develop that, but can you also take on the fact that when the British Empire set up as a kind of formal entity in India, one of the things that was done, I think, under the guidance of Lord Macaulay, was to go in search with correlative documents within Indian traditions. The laws of Manu, for example, which often had a religious basis or a caste basis, and then somehow incorporate and mix them up with aspects of, in fact, not only English law, but also, for example, the Napoleonic Code was incorporated into the IPC. Can you just say a little about that whole process of how the laws that you live under, we live under now in India, you know, where they all came from?
Sure. So our constitution looked at a variety of sources. Our assembly looked at a large variety of sources in coming up with the document, to the extent that some critics of the constitution described it as a patchwork. And Dr. Ambedkar's response to this was that even if a patchwork, at least it's a beautiful patchwork. Now, if you look at the number of times the Magna Carta has been cited, my sense is, although I've not done the research on this yet, that it's been cited much less than many other documents, than, say, the US Constitution, the Japanese Constitution, other constitutions such as that of Ireland. And the reason for that may be obvious. The reason may well be that much water has flown under the bridge since the Magna Carta was enacted. And of course, we've evolved in many ways in our thinking in modern constitutionalism. Now, on this issue of the inclusiveness or lack of inclusiveness of the Magna Carta, I think it's also important to emphasize that this was a product of its time. It needs to be viewed as a document from its time. And even a document such as the US Constitution, which was enacted, over 500 years later, contains some quite regrettable provisions. To take examples, there was a provision in the US Constitution called the 3/4 Clause, which treated African Americans as 3/4 of a citizen for the purposes of representation in the legislature. In addition, as we all know, the US Constitution also denied women the right to vote. Notwithstanding that, we do rely on the US Constitution as something of a fountainhead of political liberty. And therefore, considered in that historical and cultural context, I think we would be safe in continuing to rely on the Magna Carta as long as we acknowledge what its limitations were during the time.
Could I just add one thing to that, doing a little bit better for Magna Carta than perhaps Helena did, which is the most famous chapter in Magna Carta of all is chapter 39. It's still on the statute book of the United Kingdom today. And what's it say? It says, no free man shall be deprived of property, outlawed, put into prison, save by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. So where does this leave women? Well, I think actually we can be a bit optimistic
David,
there.
can you just explain exactly what was meant by a free man at that time?
Well, first of all, the Latin for man is homo there. But I think there was a real understanding in the 13th century that homo was used in the sense of human being. And so that would protect women as well as men, the most famous chapter. But Patrick very wisely says, of course, it's not all women, it's free women and free men. And that does exclude a large section of the society. As I've said, if we could make you an audience not of prosperous 21st century Indians here, but put you back as 13th century population in England, 2/3 of you would actually be unfree peasants, men and women, and you're not covered by that fundamental clause. But as history goes on, in the 14th century, that clause was actually glossed and altered to mean no man of any estate, so no woman of any estate too. And so by the 14th century, it does come to embrace everybody. And so I think, you know, in the medieval period, the Charter is flexible and is beginning to develop and beginning to cover everybody.
Perhaps worth, stating, in fact, that the principle of men and women being included in the UN Charter of Human Rights came from an Indian lawmaker, Hansa Mehta, who was involved in the creation of the Indian Constitution. She was the one who said to Eleanor Roosevelt, there's no point in having this word every man and thinking it's going to apply to every woman, because in India that would not be the case. You need to state every man and every woman, and that's why that wording was included. Can I just turn to Claire now? Claire, you mentioned to me beforehand the idea of Magna Carta becoming a universal symbol for justice and liberties, which is sort of used and appropriated by campaigners in all kinds of ways. And I know that you brought that out to an extent through the exhibition. Can you just say, who takes it up and why people take it up and why they want to use Magna Carta as the basis of exploring liberties?
Well, in the 17th century, Magna Carta was used to oppose the tyranny of the early Stuart kings by Sir Edward Coke, who was the Lord Chief Justice. And he used it to support Parliament in opposing the tyranny of those kings, and that led to the issuing of the Petition of Right. But then by the 18th century, there's been a real shift, and by that stage, radicals are wanting to use Magna Carta against Parliament. So instead of it being Parliament against the King, by the 18th century, the radicals are using it to try and get reform of Parliament and to argue for more representation. And Magna Carta becomes a sort of badge that anybody campaigning for any sort of cause needs to pin to them. And I think with the proliferation of print culture in the 18th century, it appears on all sorts of handbills and cited in newspapers. And in the exhibition we had some ceramics, things like teapots and mugs, where the images of these radicals holding on to Magna Carta were reproduced, and it's this sort of domestication of the idea of Magna Carta, taking it out of the legal and political sphere and bringing it into the domestic world, and it becomes something that everybody knows about, and this really powerful symbol. But I think in curating the exhibition in the context of this big English and British national anniversary, it was very interesting, because I think Magna Carta's really important in the story that England wants to tell about itself, and perhaps America wants to tell about itself as well. And clearly Magna Carta was used in some ways as a justification for empire, and the idea that, we had ideas of liberty and rights, but obviously those rights were routinely not made available to people in the countries that were being colonized. And one of the big sort of strap lines for the organising committee of the Magna Carta, the anniversary, the national anniversary, was England's greatest export. So, and I think it's, that was quite a two-dimensional view of it. And one of the things we tried to do in the exhibition was not just to help people understand about the medieval history of Magna Carta and to have an opportunity to encounter these original documents, but to really try to get people to think about how Magna Carta has been used and how the uses to which it has been put have influenced the development of its meaning, and how it has helped it to become this iconic document and one of the most famous documents in the world.
Thank you. Helena, there's a big argument going on, and I guess it's been going on all through your professional career, but it seems to be kind of gathering speed now, about the universal applicability of the protections of rights and laws and human rights. And there are various legal scholars who seem to be sort of arguing that maybe it does not or should not have a universal applicability, which dovetails quite nicely with various strongmen world leaders who are pushing laws aside and the idea that they should be applied, and saying, well, to an extent the whole principle behind human rights was a Western imposition. Have you developed and changed your views on that over the years?
I'm going to make a confession straight away, which is that I, of course, invoke Magna Carta all the time. And although I have this skepticism about, just what's in there and what it really did do, I think it has become iconic, and therefore is a very useful tool for someone like me who takes cases against government to use it to remind courts and to remind the public and to hopefully even remind the tabloid press that we have a history of commitment to something grander, which is about freedom and liberty and so on. So it has great value for us in trying to make change in our society, I hope for the better. And so, I mean, we've recently gone through a period of where people were locked up, detained without trial. And so we had to remind people and the courts and government that actually the detention without trial was unacceptable and that it dated back and was part of our history. So I've done all of that. So don't think that I'm here being a purist about Magna Carta. I can be ruthlessly using it like everybody else. But what I would say is that there is a sort of complacency in Britain where we like this, we self-flatter. It's part of our own story that we invented great law and we exported it around the world and you're all great beneficiaries of it and you should all be so grateful to us. I mean, I think that there's something very paternalistic and patronizing about that. But what I do think is that we have to fight for rights continues, and therefore using these icons and using these symbols is very important. And so for me, the use of Magna Carta, and I do it all the time, I can promise you, I say this was the beginning, it was the seed of something, but it's something that we should be proud of, and therefore remind government when they seek to abuse human rights, involved in rendition, involved in the ghastly thing, sending people back to places where they'll be tortured, that kind of thing, that we have to take our stand on it, and reminding people of our history is a good way of doing it.
But are human rights universal? Are they applicable in every society today?
Well, listen, if you look at Eleanor Roosevelt's, kind of project, she didn't just sit there, in the United States and think, I've got a good idea and write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She sat down with jurists and legal thinkers and judges and lawyers and philosophers from around the world, including from India. And so she had the benefit of many cultures and many inputs into what are the values that we share. And I always think it goes back to those basic things about what make us human, the need to love and be loved. The idea that we yearn for understanding about, what's it all about. So therefore, our need for the protections of belief systems and religion, the right to fair trial before your liberty is taken away from you. Those are things that everybody understands. Causing of pain in the form of torture and the protections against torture, not just because of what it does to the person who's tortured, but also because of the kind of horror of what it does to the spirit and soul of the person who's doing it. So these are things that are shared by everybody, and I think there are common values that we have to fight for. And the people who say it's not universal are usually people who are holding power to themselves. Beware of them.
I can feel the T word hovering over everything that you've just said, but it's not actually been stated. Chintan, I'd like to ask you the same question I asked Helena, but also please do address this thing of the extent to which religious law is incorporated into not only the penal code in India, but also the way in which different kind of social laws operate. And in particular, the fact that there is not a uniform civil code in this country.
Right. So one way in which our Constituent Assembly attempted to resolve difficult issues was through a technique known as avoidance. So what they did was that very often they prescribed, directive principles to start with, but even with the Uniform Civil Code, this was a difficult issue on which there was very hard to get political consensus. And the way in which it was resolved was to set up a provision which said that we will aspire to set up a uniform civil code, 10, 15, 20 years into the Constitution's functioning, because we essentially decide not to decide at this stage. So that, I think, is in a sense a reflection of the wisdom of our Constitution makers. Now, one more thing I'd like to say about the Magna Carta is, there's a very interesting piece of extract from the Assembly debates which almost reveals the different perceptions of the Magna Carta. So, for instance, on the one hand, we have the Dalit activist who welcomed a advisory committee report on minorities by describing it as a Magna Carta for the welfare of Harijans. On the other hand, we have someone by the name of Seth Damodar Swaroop, who was also a member of the assembly, who said, and we, as many of you may be aware, we have quite a strong right to property at the time that our constitution was enacted. And he said that the right to property is a Magna Carta in the hands of capitalists. So in a sense, it still remains a quite highly divisive document. And it's almost an exercise of wish fulfillment. I think that's what we're getting at. It's a symbol, and it's almost as though the rights that one believes should be in a constitutional document, you think were in the Magna Carta. So it's an empty vessel which you fill with all of your aspirational rights, liberties, and so on.
That's great. So I think we'll now open up to questions from the audience. But just before we do, one quick question to David. The knights and the barons, when they sat together and eventually agreed the final text, would they have been expecting us to be talking about it in India all these years later?
Well, that's just what I was thinking. And yes and no. The charter was granted by the king in perpetuity. It was supposed to last forever. But of course, that was just what I was thinking. I was thinking, how extraordinary. Runnymede, 1215. Who could possibly have conceived then? They didn't even know India existed. That 801 years later, here in Jaipur, Magna Carta would be celebrated. And can I just pick up one thing? Said, an empty vessel. Well, yes, but also no, because Magna Carta's most famous clauses are not empty vessels at all. They are very, very specific about the rule of law. No free person, and ultimately, as I said to you, that becomes no one. No one is to be deprived of property, exiled, put into prison, in any way proceeded against, save by the lawful judgment of their peers, which means their social equals, or the law of the land. There's nothing empty about that. It's the most fundamental protection we can ever have against tyranny.
Thank you very much. I'm tempted to digress onto the subject of preventive detention, but let's instead have some questions.
Can I just say something about that? Helena was so right, that when the government in Britain wished to have a 90-day detention period for people accused of terrorist offences, what was the heading in The Guardian opposing it? It was protecting Magna Carta, which shows just how relevant and how right you are to use it again and again.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll take a few questions at a time and then group them together. There's a woman in the middle there, so if you'd like to go first, yeah. And then there's also a man over to my left here, so if you could ask the next question after her. Thank you. Somebody's about to give you a microphone. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay.
I'm asking this question in all humility. I must admit that I am not a political science student, not a law student. But, you know, I've been listening to all this and listening to the flexibility, the empty vessel, full vessel debate all the time. And I'm reminded of something I read during my reading in nationalist movement. Someone had written, I'm sorry I can't recall the name, someone had written that Magna Carta was nothing more than a result of power struggle between British aristocracy and the British king, and all the grand attributes of power to the people, of democracy, etc., human rights, have been just attributed, and they were not on the picture 800 years ago at all. And therefore, all the grandioses which has been assigned with Magna Carta is really a false one. I do not know. I'm just really...
Thank you very much. So we have a questioner here. And then after you, I think there's a woman in the front row, so she could be the third question.
Is it on?
No.
No?
Yes, yes.
No,
yes.
okay. So recently I found out that the church had a significant role to play in the Magna Carta. It's something that's usually left out of conversations about it. The Archbishop Stephen Langton mediated and I believe was involved in writing it. I was wondering, was it just the role of mediation, or is there some greater influence that the church had in drafting the Magna Carta. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Morning, everyone. Myself, Komal Jain, and I have specialized in constitutional law from National Law School. My question is to Chintan Chandrachud, sir. Sir, I completely agree with your opinion about the Magna Carta. Much appreciated, sir. My question is that it is good to look into your glorious legal past. When we look at the Indian law, even we have the Manusmriti to look at. But when we look at the Indian constitution, it did derive a few things from the Magna Carta, a few words, especially in the preamble. For example, justice, liberty, equality, etc. But don't you think we are way past the Magna Carta and the Indian law has evolved, especially when we talk about Article 21, right to life and personal liberty? It's not just life and personal liberty, but the right to live with a dignified standard, a dignified human standard, according to Indian precedents like Maneka Gandhi versus Union of India, etc. So that is my question. Plus, another thing that I want to counter...
Quickly, please.
Yes, sir. Another thing that I want to counter is that right to property was a fundamental legal right in the Indian Constitution way back. Now, Article 300, that is right to property, is no longer a fundamental right. So, what do you think? How much have we evolved past the Magna Carta that was a glorious legal past in the 13th century? And now, look at the Indian Constitution and the law.
That's a great question, thank you.
Yeah.
And if we can just have one quick question from the man in the front here.
Just wondering about the struggle for human rights in the UK. With Brexit imminent, how much can, because I heard that British law was based on the European law, can Theresa May take away the Human Rights Act and change it, and would she?
Okay, so I'm actually going to start with the question that was directed at you, Chintan Chandrachud. And particularly the second part of it, the alteration of the right to property.
Yes.
I think I'm right in saying in 1977,
Yes.
during the emergency. So in other words, you know, there are certain basic principles which are being changed, and yet nobody's bothered to reverse them 40 years later.
Right. I think the thinking behind the right to property, and I guess this is one of the great injustices with that constitutional amendment, was that it was essentially intended to enable property to be taken away from the land magnates. And it was in the context of the zamindari system and social revolution in India. Unfortunately, what's happened now ever since is that it's being used the other way around. In other words, it's the poor peasants, it's the agriculturists who are being deprived of their property and who can't lean on a fundamental right in order to acquire it. So I think this is, you've correctly pointed out that this is one of the great injustices of the Indian Constitution. In terms of the preamble to the Constitution, I think we would look probably closer to the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, rather than to the Magna Carta. So I would think that that's the closer origin than the Magna Carta itself. I would also agree with your point of view that we don't actually need to look at the Magna Carta. Our constitutional system is far too evolved for our courts to go back to that stage now. We have landmark judgments, other jurisdictions cite our judgments all the time. And I guess it also comes down to a question of how much credit you give an ancestor for the successes of the heirs, right? And I think some credit, but not too much, is probably the answer.
Helena, will you take on the question of Brexit and the potential repeal of human rights law? Can it happen? Will it happen?
Well,
will you let it happen?
I will not let it happen. I have to tell you that it's often misunderstood in the general public in Britain that the European Convention on Human Rights is derived from our belonging to the Council of Europe, which is not the European Union. And so that will remain even with Brexit, although the Conservative Party included the removal of our incorporation of it into the Human Rights Act and our getting out of the European Convention on Human Rights as part of their manifesto at the last election, and they're quite determined to do that, and certainly Theresa May has said is one of her objectives. But at the moment, that has been put to one side. The other court that we deal with, as well as the European Court of Human Rights, which is, as I say, does not depend on our belonging to the European Union, There are 46 countries, including Russia, involved in that. But the European Court of Justice is what determines issues that are, relate to our belonging to the European Union. So we will be leaving the European Court of Justice. Theresa May has made that very clear. And with that, we do lose a whole lot of rights. And we're going to have to argue for them to be retained. Employment rights, the rights to maternity leave, the rights of part-time workers, all manner of rights that have come from the European Court of Justice and from our belonging to the European Union and the regulations that have come from that. Consumer rights, rights relating to protections of the environment, and so, and trade rights, you know, small businesses should be concerned because lots of those things about getting enforcement of orders in British courts against people who owe them money because they did a deal with them and then they didn't pay up. And so to get those enforced in the other country, there are regulations to make it happen. That's all going to go unless we argue and fight for them to be retained in British law. And so that has to be part of the negotiation. So our rights are at stake, and we should be telling citizens in Britain that they're at stake. But what we have to recognise is that, that rights have to be struggled for, and they're a constant thing that we have to be vigilant about. They're never given to you, and as they say, in perpetuity, it doesn't work that way, and we have to keep constantly keep gnawing at the bone of the law that's been given to us.
Gnaw at the bone. Claire and David, can you both take on the two questions? You know, one was about whether this can simply be seen as a power struggle between two groups of people, or the king and the knights in Britain, and the second one about the role of the church. So would you both like to address that?
I'll do the other bit. So I think one of the important things to remember about Magna Carta, apart from, you know, this fundamental clause that David recited before, is that it did make a very practical change, because it changed the way that the king could raise income. And that was really important because it cut off or greatly reduced the king's source of income from these feudal, traditional, medieval payments that he was due from the barons. And so he became much more reliant on the consent of the kingdom for payments. And in Magna Carta was issued in 1215, but then new versions of it were issued in 1216, 17 and 1225. And it was the 1225 version that ultimately ended up on the statute book. And that includes an explicit statement that the rights in Magna Carta are being granted in return for a more general grant of taxation with the consent of the kingdom. And that's really important in terms of paving the way for the calling of the first parliament later in the 13th century. And also Magna Carta sort of involved, you know, the barons are obviously very prominent, but it does involve the knights and the burgesses from the towns who are also key figures in the calling of that first parliament. So one of the, you know, I've already mentioned this strapline about England's greatest export. Another strapline the Magna Carta 800 committee had was 800 years of democracy, which, you know, many people kind of struggled with the idea that there've been 800 years of democracy. And I mean, no women had the right to vote even 100 years ago in the UK. But it was really, really important because of this shift in raising money and the idea of consent. And that was, I think, a turning point that Magna Carta generated.
Thank you. David?
Just to quickly pick up 2 points of Helena and Claire. The first is that, yes, it's, you know, Magna Carta's got a real lesson for us in that rights have to be struggled and fought for. And both in 1215 itself, but then the whole of the next century, people in England are struggling to affirm and actually enforce the rights in Magna Carta. And as I said, they really treasured this document and they knew its detail, and that's so important. And to pick up the direct point, you asked the question, the role of Stephen Langton. Well, absolutely. I think his role was very important in 1215. He was a professor in politics, and he did 2 things. He first of all put the church into the charter. at Runnymede. He introduced the first chapter of Magna Carta. He may well have written it, protecting the privileges and the liberties of the church. And if that chapter hadn't been put there, the church would never have put its back into protecting and supporting Magna Carta. And its excommunications promulgated against people who violated the Charter in the 30th century was very important. But also Langton's more general ideas about the rule of law, you know, all these ideas he got from his study and lecturing at the University of Paris, I think fed into the whole culture of the age and greatly strengthened the kinds of forces preventing that kind of tyrannical rule.
I think it's really wonderful, and I always sort of tease people about the fact that it was Langton's business in France that had infected him with ideas that penetrated the Magna Carta. So we actually could say that it was the French influence that created it, and that it wasn't truly English at all.
Intellectual historians will be very happy to hear about these ideas travelling across the continent. Lucky there wasn't fog in the channel preventing that one from arriving.
Thank you very much, everyone, and to our lovely guests. Wonderful session. We've got some scarves for you as well. Thank you, Claire, Chintan, David, Helena, and Patrick, and also the British Library, who we've had this session in collaboration with. Our next session will begin at 12:30, The Secret History of Capitalism. And I would remind you too that we do, as the guests